Hello, everyone. This is our secure brainstorming meeting on Tuesday, for some of us, June 23rd, 2020. Today, we're talking about whether or not we need to release new versions of our security report schema when we add required fields and other related items. Okay, so would anyone like to give a quick intro to what we're talking about? No. Cool. Okay. So during our Secure Weekly, this topic came up, and I think that the primary reason that Cam raised this is because there's a new merge request to add a field called vendor to our security report schema for all security reports that goes within the scanner object. This will be used to capture which vendor is providing the scanner, defaulting to Gitlab. Well, maybe not technically defaulting to Gitlab, but by usage, we are all Gitlab. And it can also be things like white source. So I skimmed through that merge request and related issue. I don't know if someone else has more context around that, but we may need this in the future for showing vendors. Presumably, if it's missing, it is Gitlab, and it matches all of our former ones, which we have not provided before. There may be exceptions to that, which I think white source might be one of those because they don't currently provide this field since we don't really support it yet. And if we're talking about two different things here, we're talking about adding this as a required field to our schema and whether or not that reflects in our UI as well. Okay, so current state, thank you, absent Cam, for adding these points. When adding a new optional field, so far it has been considered an addition change. And quick refresher on SchemaVer, model, revision, addition. When you make a breaking change that will not match historical data, that's a major change. If it may affect historical data, that's the equivalent of a minor change, would be the revision, and the equivalent of a patch is called an addition, which is when you make a schema change that is compatible with all historical data. So far we have been making additions with new optional fields. New scan type secret detection has been considered a revision change, and no fields have been removed, so that's cool. We don't have to deal with that yet. No required fields have been added. No major releases have been made. So if we add new fields to our schema, should they be marked as required?
So I think one of the confusing parts or part of the discussion around this was understanding the scope of the versioning. So if we're just talking about the versioning of the schema and the JSON, maybe the conversation is just around that. And then what Rails does is a separate conversation, right? So whether Rails requires a version, whether it's backwards compatible, whether it defaults values, things of that sort, I think that might be a separate issue. I think when we're talking about schema version and how we handle that, that really needs to be its own atomic discussion, right? Like what's the right way to do that from schema? And then the Rails is a separate question, right? Like we can say, okay, Rails, if you don't have the required field, fill it in with a default value, whatever. But I think we don't want to conflate those two because it gets really messy if we do that. And it's not technically accurate.
You're absolutely right. I think that was the part that was not obvious to everyone. And yeah, I don't see the problem with saying that from now on, this field is required in all the reports. It's not tied to the, as you said, to the Rails backend. That the field will always be optional for the Rails backend, for example, and that's fine. If we don't have the value, we don't display anything. That's really a problem.
So if we said it's required and we agree that that's a new schema version bump, that's fine. That's how we handle it on the schema. And then The Rails, we get to decide how that handles it. Maybe it can handle back to version 1 or version 2 or whatever. We set Rails has to have a minimum version or whatever, but that's a separate issue.
Well, the answer is simple. Since we already have a lot of vulnerabilities in the database and we don't have that data, it's not required because we don't have the data. So
right.
So what's the point of making this required in the schema?
Because we want that data to be always present in the future. And especially for us, it's going to be obvious. It's going to be GitLab all the time. But for the vendors, we want to make sure that they're going to report with their vendor name.
Yeah, and I guess at a certain point, we can also say any vendor that's got an integration has to be on version X of the schema, right? Because we don't want vendors just giving us 2 pieces of data. We're trying to display 30 in the dashboard, and
they will want to have their name in the dashboard, believe me.
Right. Yeah.
So,
yeah. But by requiring
and they can say we don't have the
fields,
value.
yeah.
You know, it's a static field, so they can say we were not able to generate the value. So.
Yep.
That's
and
great.
this will
13 minutes.
That will allow us to say, for example, starting with 14.0, we no longer support any schema prior to version X. And this allows us to move forward and deprecate all the report structures and drop the support from the Rails application. So handling historical data would be another challenge. So it looks like we are agreeing on this, at least.
Yeah, so it sounds like the schema version is just strictly scoped to, are we updating the schema version based on what we want to add, required or not, and whatever that, whatever those changes are.
Should we go through the question of Cameron and try to put an answer there?
I agree with 1A. Or is there any disagreement with that point?
I'm not sure I understand this one.
Me neither.
So I think in this case, it's just if a field is conceptually required, like vendor, as you said earlier, Philippe, we kind of need that, then it should be required. I think it's just a nice to have because that's ideally what we want there. It's going to make our lives a lot easier. I think we've essentially already agreed to this, that it makes sense to make that required in the schema, just not the Rails app.
I don't get if it's required. It's not nice to have. There are 2 contradictory ideas in there.
I think it's nice to have it be required. That was my read.
So it's required.
I think I think this is where we're conflating it. It's required in the schema. If you produce a report, we need the vendor name. So it has to be in the schema, and anyone building a scanner has to provide it on the schema. So when you're writing your analyzer, if you're on version 2 and you want to go to version 2 point whatever this is, you have to have that field. On the Rails is going to treat it as nice to have. If it can get it, great. It's going to display it. If it can't, Rails is going to deal with that gracefully. So
maybe we should start using should must language for these things.
Yep.
Thank you. I think the nice, okay, I get it. Maybe the nice to have is if you want to stick to the current schema version that doesn't have the vendor name, maybe you can do that. But that's.
Yeah, and that's the way, if you have an analyzer and you don't have, let's say, the scanner name, you would use a previous version of the schema version. So you'd use a previous version. And at some point, GitLab is going to say, hey, we no longer support that version in the Rails app. You need to go up to the new version of the schema.
That's a great question. I wonder if we already have some kind of requirements like this, like some fields are absolutely necessary, and if you use another version of the schema, it's going to break the parser, for example. I don't think we have documented that.
No, because we're at the beginning and this is the first iteration of the schemas. We don't yet have the verification, the validation of the schema in place. So it's purely theoretical right now.
And we mostly added new fields, right? We haven't updated fields or removed any of them.
No, we did something relatively similar.
Major too, then.
Because it's what I was going to say. We already did that something similar in the past, because when we moved to the legacy format to this one, we moved from an array at the top level to an object. So this was a breaking change, and we moved to from version 1 to version 2, and we supported version 1 for quite some time until a major version of GitLab, for example. So this is a similar process here. It's just that now it's officially supported by this schema.
So when we have like a field drop like CVE, when we drop CVE, that would be, I believe that would be a revision, because it doesn't really matter if they send it or don't send it. We just won't process it on the Rails side. So the idea of, I guess it's easy for us to define rules around the schema to ensure that we get all the data we need. But I guess that's the big difference between the revision and the addition, is that whether or not we care about processing that data. So requiring the vendor works for us when we don't use it. But once we start requiring it, that will be the major version bump. Sorry, Nina in the UI.
That also some distinction we need to make, I think, between what is strictly required from a functionality perspective from what is required from a design perspective. Like if you don't provide the vendor, well, it will show an empty string somewhere in the UI, but it won't break the vulnerability management processing and any of the workflow based on the vulnerability. If you don't provide the primary identifier, things would just break. So that, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say there's another kind of cheeky way to do this, which is, let's say we add the vendor. You add the vendor as a optional field. Don't bump the version number. Then you bump the version number and required, and then it's a required field. Right, so it's optional in the existing version, but it's required in the next version. Which Rails would handle this the same, the Rails side would handle it the same way, but if you went to a later version or to a newer version, it's then required. That might add more confusion, I don't know.
Yeah.
So do we want to consider within scope of this discussion, pinning to minor versions of the schema within the Rails app, or how we want to handle versioning there? Or do we just want to talk about the schema today? Like that could be a big topic. So far we're in agreement. Maybe we should just stick with the schema. But I don't know if we can separate the two. Maybe we just can keep going with the questions here. And once we get to the bottom of the agenda, we see if that comes back up.
Yeah, I'd say let's try to get through these questions and then maybe we can figure out how Rails needs to behave.
Cool. So 1B, we do not consider this a breaking change. Is that true?
I would agree, yeah. But it's considered a breaking change from the Rails perspective here. from the schema perspective. I think it's from the raise perspective, but not quite sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think adding a new field, I can't imagine that being a breaking change if we don't use it on the Rails side.
Yeah, a breaking change if you don't do it, you'll broke something. But here now, I mean, at least for the Rails app, it won't be a breaking change because of our current policy. So great.
So it depends on what that field is. So for example, vendor name, not a big deal, right? Because we can just not display that value. If you were to add an identifier or something that you have to key off, then not having that field would be a breaking change.
No, because you need, I mean, this is a it would be a very specific use case, but usually you would have such need when adding a new feature. So let's say we're adding a feature in a new minor version of GitLab, and this requires specific data. So it requires a new field to be present. So from this new version of the schema, the property is required. And if you want the feature to work in GitLab, you need to have this version of the schema with the required field. But if you don't provide this information, GitLab will still work. You just won't have this feature. So on the Rails side, we will develop that feature to work only if the data is available. If we can't, and if we can't, then we have to do a breaking change in the minor version of GitLab, right, or wait for the major one.
Yep. Yeah, and I'm fine in this particular, like, we can just keep this to the concrete example we have here, which is if that value is not there, Rails can still run. I'm sure there's some counter examples, but there's no point in going through all those right now or trying to come up with them.
Okay, so when a new required field is added to the schema, it doesn't happen in the analyzers. When an analyzer updates the reports to conform to a more recent version of the format, they can add, it's not they can, they must add required fields, since we should validate against the schema. I say should because we don't have it yet, but validate reports.
Do we have an issue around validating the schema for the analyzers?
Yeah. It's not clear yet how we want to do it. One option is to have this as part of the QA, so that part of our downstream pipelines, when we run the report, we validate against the correct version of the schema. But no, it's currently in 13.4. Okay. SchemaVer recommends that new required fields are model change. Well, then we should follow that. Because the schema version should be independent from everything else, I think we should comply to this. Please object, because I say all. So if you don't agreeing with that, please object.
I don't know if this is an anti-pattern, but is there utility in coordinating additions so we can release versions more, like, so we can group changes rather than every individual change to the schema being or triggering a new model change. Maybe there's no point in doing that. We can just bump the model as many times as necessary, but I don't know if that would be valuable to consider. Maybe we need an RFC issue within the issue or within the security report schema repo or something.
I think it's a bit similar to when we are doing new version of the analyzers. Like, do you release exactly after merging a merge request, or do you wait for some do a bulk do a new version with multiple changes from multiple merge requests? There is
I guess we have release candidates too, so we can do however many of those we want.
Yeah. All right, next one. Interestingly, it also recommends that new optional fields are a revision change when additional property is true. This one is a bit tricky. I spent some time looking at this. Yeah, it's not clear anymore in my mind, but yeah, this additional property is I'd say a high level setting for the schema that say, is the report valid if it contains only what is mentioned in the schema, or if it contains at least what is in the schema? So if vendors, if third party, for example, are pushing more property than what we declare in the schema, with additional properties true, it will work. They will be considered valid. But if we say false, then they will be considered invalid. And this has a fundamental distinction on the way you are doing revisions.
I'm not sure I follow that. Can you say
It's
that
not,
again or use different words?
it's not exactly clear in my mind and the implication, but additional properties mean, if it's true, it means you can already have many additional fields in the report and it's considered valid. So if you add one or anyone add one, it doesn't change anything. So it's more like a revision than a model change, because there should be no breaking changes. Otherwise, it means if any vendor provide a report that contains additional properties and we allow that, it could break our app. We don't want this. So,
do we allow additional properties on any fields currently?
yeah, I was against that because I didn't want somebody to put everything they want there and instead constrain them into a specific field that we had for them. But there was good arguments against that, and they are in the merge request.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the main reason is we didn't want data loss. So if you have a scanner that's generating 50 fields and GitLab can only use 3 of them, if you don't have a place to put those extra 47 fields, that results in data loss and that just gets thrown out. And so having additional properties, you can just throw those in there. GitLab blissfully ignores them, or should blissfully ignore them. And we just have those extra fields.
What you can do then is, I mean, at least this is still my vision. I don't think we have settled something that is agreed on the world stage, but the purpose of the report, the secure report, is to feed the Rails application and its features. So everything that we don't leverage, we don't need into this report. If you are worried about loading data, historical data coming from scanner that we don't yet leverage, it is still possible to put the raw report as a separate artifact that you can literally use or provide directly to the users, because if third-party users want to use them, because if they are available in the JSON report, but we don't parse it and store it in the database, it will disappear with the garbage collection of the artifact anyway. So, I mean, not a big deal. We can change that later, but at least this is the current situation for additional properties. But I think there were other arguments to keep it this way, but I don't recall them. I'm sorry. So anyway, right now it's true. So.
Okay, so for this one, I think that makes sense. Cool. I understand this comment now. Do we need to talk more about F or? No, awesome. So we're getting up on time. Some might say we're over. Is there anything that we need to address remaining here? Because Cam did a really good job of filling this out. Do we need to wait for a new version? So point 2. I don't think so. Especially if we're keeping them decoupled for now.
Yeah, I think they should be decoupled, and it's really just a limit on how the monolith is coded, and I think we want the monolith coded in a way that does not require a breaking change there.
Cool. What versions from 2 of the SRF are supported? We figured this out. Agreed. We figured this out and document it and test it.
So far it should be all because we just had one major model version. So it should be all, but it means any additional field is not fully required. So this is not really true. This is where, I mean, it's true because it supports all of them. So the last one where it's required and the last one and the previous one where it's not. But it's just that it's more about, it's compatible with all those versions. Yeah.
Do we support the version 1 still? Top level vulnerabilities, Ray?
No. In 14.0 we dropped the legacy data proxy report and container scanning report, I think.
Cool.
But the Rails app may be able to parse those just fine.
We dropped the pauther, at least for container scanning, and I know we dropped the pauther for the old.
Because sometimes we update the formats and we don't rip out the old code. So if you have old artifacts, it might still be working just fine. I think that's the biggest challenge here is Rails, how much Rails knows about the schema changes versus how much Rails is just smart and says, hey, I don't have that field, let me do this. And I think that's something that we need to define very closely as to, does Rails, who's ever programming that Rails side, need to go and look at the schema changes and understand every change? Or are we gonna have some guidelines like, hey, look for anything between these versions, and if you don't have the field, just fill it in or make it blank. And I don't know if there's a standard answer to that question.
Well, I think it also gets into the pinning to minor version in our CI templates, because at a certain point, analyzers are still pulling in the latest version, and if you're still on 12.9, things are going to get bad. So we really have like 3 separate versions that we're coordinating.
Yeah, exactly. So if you pin to an old version of the analyzer, the old version of the analyzer is spitting out an old version of the schema, and Rails doesn't handle that old version of the schema, everything's going to work, and then it's going to go to parse it, and it's going to say, I don't understand that schema version. Or it might just throw up.
Yeah. That's why we initially goes with just one major for everybody, the same major everywhere, and it was to avoid that kind of stuff. But yeah.
So okay, so yes, we should test it. So far, it should be all of them. What happens when they are not compatible? Do we support everything forever, or we have a standard 3 versions back process, so I think that we can do a similar thing, although somewhere we have to start tracking version support per Rails app.
Yeah, I mean, the way I would see this is potentially that the Rails app has an allow list of version numbers for the schema version. So Rails says if it's version blah, 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 I know how to deal with it, and it sends it to its own parser. And then I can see Rails saying, okay, this is a version that is not on my allow list, and it needs to convert that into some kind of error message that goes out to the user. And that could just be saying, hey, whatever analyzer you ran is not providing me with a report I can parse.
Do we have an issue for error handling within the parser still? Because that's kind of been a long-term pain point. We can say something went wrong, but we still don't have a good system for that.
There are already some mechanics in the backend code to report errors at different parts of the parsing, the processing, but not fully end to end, so it's not showing up anywhere. So,
but at least for the time being, you'll see a big banner that says, excuse me, that secure report parsing failed, or the MR widget will break. So there's something. Okay.
But that sounds like something we need to give the user some better output.
Yeah. If you're using something like merge request approvals, then that should be covered, because merge request approvals reset approvals on push events. So it will default to unapproved rather than approved. I think that's the only case where we're really, I think merge request approvals is the only real feature we provide currently for like active gating. Okay.
So I think we may have talked about this in our weekly. Who's responsible for parsing those report, like checking the schema versions and parsing that? So if we create an allow list of these schema versions, there needs to be, let's say, a migration path from one version to the next, which Rails is going to, let's say, default to value. We don't really know who's responsible for programming that and testing that.
I believe David said there is a meeting this week to discuss that.
I think it's next Tuesday or next Monday. Next Tuesday. Who owns what and why? It's just 25 minutes. I'm assuming we need more of that. Yeah. Like a ton of things that say, well, if you need to work on it, then you're responsible for the changes you're making there. Status quo for now, I think.
Yeah, it's just a problem. It's the scope of testing, right? So if we, on the dash side, we add a field, if it's not there and then it is there, we'll test that. But we have a potential of breaking something from any of the other teams because our window is very limited. As opposed to if our window was the dashboard, we have to make sure that we can read all the reports and deal with those consistently. Wow. So I think assigning it to individual teams is nice, but I think we're going to end up, we have the potential of breaking things from other teams because that's not our scope.
It should not break because unless we're changing mind on this, they fundamentally follow the same process, the same behavior, and the same data model, whatever the report type. So you have additional properties that are useful for display mainly today. If we change and add behavior, this behavior should be conditional to the presence of the data. So any vulnerability that don't have it, whether because it's a null data or because it's a different report type that doesn't provide that data, the feature should just be disabled, but it should not break.
Yeah, I'm thinking like, for example, if we add a field, Dash adds a field, we go update the Rails parser, we have all that data in there. And so we may neglect testing if that field's not there. Although I guess technically we should test if the field's not there for backwards compatibility.
Yep.
So if we test for backwards compatibility, that would ensure that we don't break anything from SAST or CA.
Yeah. Basically, all new features we're adding on top of the vulnerabilities behave like that because.
Right. Now, if we naively just test and say, oh yeah, it works, this new field is there,
This is
and
a
we don't
required
test
field.
if we don't test our own backwards compatibility. Now, so there's that scenario, right? Which would just be not necessarily good engineering, but like it could happen where we know on DAS, maybe almost all of our users are on the latest version, right? So we test that field works. We forget to test backwards compatibility. We roll this out, immediately it would break stuff for other teams.
Yeah, if the UI is breaking, if the property is not there, yes. But I mean, it's a pretty.
Well, I mean, it might not get to the UI. It might just choke on the parsing. That's I think the bigger issue.
Well, the way the parser are made, you have a common parser that should contain all the common behavior. So if this is something very specific to Dast, I don't see anything yet that could break the others. If it's just not done for the others, it just don't do anything additional to the user workflow. So it's just a matter of when we will leverage that additional information.
Mm-hmm.
And so far, most of them are just for display. But if we start adding features, well, then people definitely need to think more about, well, testing the feature. But yeah, it could happen that you're testing just for the DAS vulnerabilities and not trying to display, for example, the vulnerability page for another type and then it breaks. It can happen.
I know there was a small failure we had recently. I think, was it container scanning where it just kept reloading? Do you know what the details around that issue were, or that bug?
I believe that was for the security reports repo that uses like fixtures of old security reports for easy testing. Mm-hmm. And that was the scanner object was missing, which was added like in an older version of that, probably added like 6 months ago to the container scanning reports. Mm-hmm. So it was parsing an old copy of the container scanning reports that didn't have the scanner object. I want to archive that repo, by the way, but
the security reports.
Maybe it's useful for this. Yeah,
maybe it's
useful
great
for this discussion.
Yeah, yeah. But isn't that kind of what we're talking about? Like, if you have an old report, so let's say SAST or DAST or whatever, DAST has an old report, an old schema, and SAST is, whatever, 6 months ahead of us in getting this schema.
I think that the primary difference is that we parse off the head pipeline. So there shouldn't really be that many occasions where we are parsing an old report. Generally, the generation of a report and the parsing of that report happen almost simultaneously.
But I guess what I'm saying is, like, someone could pin to an old version of DAST that doesn't output the latest JSON. So I could pin to, let's say, version 1 of DAST and I got version 2 of SAST.
Yeah, this is where you have this compatibility metrics between the analyzer and the RAID application. And this is why we so far have a major number pinned there, and that if user override this, it's at their own risk. And It's a big challenge of moving to a minor one. But
yeah, and I think that's just where our error handling, if we make that transparent. So it just says, hey, we got a report, but the report's an old version. And hopefully where our version exists in that report is always going to be the same. So that at the very least should work.
But this is harder when transitioning to a new major version, because depending on for how much time you have deprecated the old report, or you have to say, hey, we are deprecating this version of the schema. If we just take 3 months, it's really tricky. We should avoid that. We should keep it deprecated for a very long time, because say in February or in March, you had the older version of the schema, and now in May we say, hey, we deprecate it, and then in May we say we no longer support it. We remove the parser capability for that old schema, and then you go to a null project, restart a pipeline, or open another merge request. The artifact will still be there, so you would try to pass an old artifact, and this is when things break. But
yeah, I'm also curious what happens when people do upgrades from, like, if they're on, I don't know, 11.9, right, and then they go to 13.1. So the calendar time hasn't switched, But then all of a sudden 13.1 is trying to read these old artifacts, like very old artifacts.
Yeah. That's an issue with support and well,
Okay.
just stay up to date. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's a good use case.
Well, we don't actually in any place in our documentations recommend pinning to old versions, right? Just in the troubleshooting for like the rule syntax, I think.
Certainly not on DAST. And I don't know why we would encourage people to pin to a particular version. I view pinning to a version as a great, like you said, a troubleshooting or support thing. Like, hey, it's not working. I just, and then they go, oh yeah, we released a new version of the SAS scanner last week. Why don't you pin to a previous version? And they get it working. So that's the only case that I would recommend a customer do it.
Okay. So at a minimum, going back to where was this? Yeah, I guess just the root for this one, 3A, we should figure this out and document it. Right now, I think it'd be like a 1-column compatibility matrix, and we will do everything we can to make that not more complex.
Yeah, and it looks like what we need for our test suite for Rails would be to have versions of all the supported schemas. So if we're supporting version 2, 2.1, 2.2, we should have, as part of our test suite, regression analysis against those.
Yeah, and I think I can already say that I think a lot of the fixtures are quite outdated in the Rails app. Other people might be updating those, but as far as I'm aware, they haven't been updated in a little while.
And if we have that regression test, so if Rails tests against version 2, 2.1, 2.2, it doesn't matter what we do with schema version, because if we say 3, 4, 5, whatever, bump those to major releases, as long as Rails knows what to parse and has a test suite, those versions are to a large degree arbitrary to Rails.
Yeah, makes sense.
So just to clarify what handle means here. Sorry, because I was typing. You jumped to the point number 4.
Yeah, sorry, I just added the 4A there.
What I want to say here.
Good.
And what I wanted to say here is it's misleading that we now published a new version of the schema that say, hey, you have a scan object that provides this and this information, but the Rails implementation is not done yet. So people might try to use this new version of the schema, but they won't see any benefit from it. So maybe we should try to synchronize those publication.
Well, we're always going to have to do it in that. Well, we don't have to, but it's going to be easier to do it in that direction. Have the schema provide data first, and then have Rails display it. If we just have Rails try to display it and there's no data, that's kind of useless programming.
It's easier to do it this way because this clarifies the specification, and it's easier because if we start implementing a feature and then go back and say this is how the data should be, it's a bit complicated. It's more from the advertisement around this. So if we keep this as the release candidate, I think it's fine because it's an upcoming feature. It's not yet leveraged, but again, it's not a big deal. But if some integrators are looking closely at our new version of the schema, they may try to use them. And even for us, people see that the schema has a scan object. An engineer might find, hey, where is this used in the application? I don't know about this one.
Right.
Okay.
So in terms of doesn't handle it, we're really talking still graceful failures. We haven't, and I don't think we need to go through like what would happen if it's a catastrophic break or like really a breaking change that Rails has no way to handle. I think we can talk about that when we actually run across that scenario.
So I'm putting no here. No, we shouldn't prevent for graceful failures. And I mean, I think that this is just no in general, right? We don't see a use case currently where we should prevent this.
Right. And we want to work really hard to prevent this because it's going to be a big challenge to try to sync all of the analyzers and third parties up to it. So there's almost no way to prevent publishing a new version. Yeah, so I think, Olivier, your point 5 is exactly what we're boiling this down to, which is it's required in the schema, but it's optional in the Rails app.
Yeah, well, this was fundamentally, so yeah.
So when can, and to recap, is there a point at which point we can make it required in the Rails app? I guess that's a major version.
So that would be right. So at some point, Rails will say, I no longer support this version of the schema.
Just according to the compatibility matrix, then, not really
right
necessarily.
And then what that point is, I would imagine we could sync that up with major releases. We'd obviously want to check to make sure all our internal analyzers are complying with that. And that might be something that when we release a new version of the schema, we say this will be required by such and such date. So if we release version 3 of the schema, we could say version 3 of the schema, which has all these required fields, must be emitted by your analyzer by this time next year for 14.0. So anyone who's writing an analyzer, maybe they wrote it against version 2 of the schema, they know that they have until version 14 to get to the next version of the schema.
This might be asking too much. This feels a bit JSON API, but is there a way within SchemaVer to specify relational like fields with deprecation timelines or versions or anything like that? I'm looking for like a metadata property on SchemaVer for field support. I don't feel like there is anything like that, but
I don't recall anything that does. We call this out in the description of the field, but
okay.
Yeah, I mean, we could add something to our documentation that says, version 2 will be supported at least until version 14 or something to that effect.
Yeah, that's probably a lot simpler. I was thinking at a per field basis, but that sounds crazy complicated too.
Yeah.
Cool. I'm going to embolden this TLDR, which I think covers just about everything we've talked about. Required in schema, but optional in Rails app. When can we require it via compatibility matrix, but likely sync up in major GitLab versions?
So in other words, at major GitLab versions, we will drop support for older schemas.
yeah.
And this covers 6 as well, so maybe I'll just move it down. What is 7a about? Is this?
I think we covered what 7a does, which is Rails is going to look for the schema versions and then see if it supports it, and then if it supports it, it'll know how to migrate it.
I will have to drop.
Okay.
Hi.
How do we want to move forward with this? I feel like there's like 7 or 8 issues we can create out of this and summarize this somewhere else. Do we have a DRI for that, or do we want just move on?
I was wondering if we want to go with another session with the APAC time zone. I mean, I think we nailed it this morning, but it would be great to have some feedback from other engineers, just in case they are objecting with what we said.
I'll add something this afternoon then.
Yeah, and I think maybe the way to wrap this up is to summarize this discussion in our documentation on this schema repo. So we can just say versioning and then explain very clearly. And then if we do that as an MR, we can make sure that everyone's on board and that we've documented it well.
Awesome. Are you volunteering, Seth? Or
I
can try summarizing this. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you can, I don't really have the bandwidth right now.
Cool. I will do that then after the APAC call. I'll put that on the secure calendar after this meeting.
Sounds good.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks.